Yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to this last session of day one of the workshop on the urgency of conceptual diversity. My name is Robin Dunford. I work in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Brighton. Just before beginning, another big thank you to all the organisers. It's been a great day so far, and it's been great to be able to hear talks in different languages, to see hierarchies of keynote and other speakers all broken down. So yeah, it's been really lovely so far. And on that note, accessibility has been a priority at all stages in the planning of this workshop. The speakers' texts are available on the website. Live interpretations to and from Spanish will be available throughout the 2 days to make sure that speakers can participate fully in all parts of the workshop. So for this final panel of the day, we have 4 exciting papers which stretch concepts across time, space, place, discipline, and more. If you have any questions, please post them to the Q&A, which I think is working again after a little glitch in the last session. If that's not working, they can go in the chat, but try the Q&A first. And you can do this as we're going through, hearing the speakers, and or at the end, whatever suits you. So now I will introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be presenting. Speakers, I'll let you know when you've got 1 minute left, so you know when to wrap up, so apologies in advance for any interruptions. And we'll go in the order that's on the programme. So I'll run through them all now and then introduce you all in turn. But first of all, we're going to have Maria Doma Pereira, whose paper is called Disrupting Global Hegemonies or Reinforcing Local Inequalities, Notes on the Complexities of Decolonising Citation. Then we have Asiya Islam from Cambridge University, whose paper is called Neither Hi-Fi Nor Gai-Gear, Interrogating Middleness vis-a-vis Class and Gender in Urban India. Then we're going to have Abeera from SOAS on queer secularity, stretching queer studies. And finally, we'll have Hasret Cetinkaya of National University Ireland on the epistemic violence of namus as honour. So without further ado, I will pass over to Maria. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I hope everyone can hear me. I want to start by saying that it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today. And I want to thank the organizers for the exceptionally committed work they've done backstage, not just to have us all here, but also to make this space as accessible as possible. And I want to thank the speakers for the inspiring talks. I've spent the day revising my own comments to respond and engage with the wonderful issues that you've raised and proposed. And thank you to the participants for joining us from all over. So I don't have a lot of time today, as you know, so let's see if I can do justice to the issue that I want to propose for discussion. And what I want to do today is reflect on a paradox. I'll focus on one increasingly, I would say, popular aspect of efforts to decolonize, and that specifically calls to decolonize citation. And I want to unpack a paradox that for me is at the center of those calls. And it's a paradox that has occupied me a lot in the last few months, although this is the first time I formally speak about it and indeed sort of write about it to an audience. And it has occupied me in at least 2 senses. So on the one hand, it's occupied me intellectually. I find myself thinking about it, theorizing about it, trying to make sense of it. But it also occupies me affectively. I find myself feeling things in relation to this paradox. I feel puzzled, a word I've taken from Nirmal Puar in an article that she's written recently in the Sociological Review about related issues. But also I feel other more intense things. I feel things that are maybe less generative. This paradox leaves me feeling frustrated, leaves me feeling also a little bit impatient, maybe very impatient. And maybe impatience is not the best starting point to think about paradoxes, or maybe it's the only way to think about a paradox is if you are impatient in relation to it. But I wanted to declare my affective investments at the start because and I guess this is a spoiler alert, for me, one of the things I'm going to argue later on is that I think affect is at the root of this paradox. And so I wanted to start from that as well. But I'm getting carried away. It must be that impatience. So let me start from the beginning and take you through my thoughts for today. So again, I want to reflect on a paradox. And that paradox is the fact that for me in feminist scholarship, I think many of you, all of you will agree, we have, and indeed we value, complex theories of power. We value a recognition of contingent intersections between different axes of inequality. We value an awareness of messiness and an engagement with messiness. And yet I feel that in a lot of the more common calls that we are producing at the moment, especially in Anglophone literature, about decolonising citation, I feel that as a community, we sometimes or very often slip into some quite binary and quite essentialist framings of power. Framings of power that, in my opinion, disavow contingency, complexity, and indeed intersectionality. And so, because I think it is crucial to decolonize citation, I don't want to question that at all. But what I do want to do is ask questions about the assumptions that we're making, because I believe that recognizing that complexity will help us decolonize citation more effectively. So what's the problem that I notice? So you will know as well as I do, better than me, in fact, this is not my area of expertise in some ways. In Anglophone debates, I mention Anglophone debates because I think these things are written in Anglophone debates in particular ways. We are seeing more calls to decolonize citation, and these calls usually invite us, as this conference is itself doing, to use concepts and theories and names from the global south or from marginal backgrounds with a view to producing knowledge that is more ethical and that disrupts power. And what I've noticed is often assumed in these calls is that disruption is somehow intrinsic to those concepts, to those theories, to those names, i.e. that if you use those concepts, those theories, those names from the global south or from certain marginal communities, you will necessarily do a certain kind of epistemic and political work in and of itself. The citation in and of itself does necessarily something, and we assume that that work that it does will primarily be progressive. But is that always the case? Is citation of certain people, does it always do a certain work, and is that work always progressive? I think this assumption is connected to a second assumption, that if a concept or a name or a theory is marginal in global relations of power between nations or between languages, then it is marginal to power, full stop. But is that really always the case? We know that there are power dynamics that happen locally in the local production of knowledge in the global south or in marginal communities. And indeed, in talks that we heard earlier today, Rabia Aslam, Olga Moon, for example, in their different talks or answers to questions, they both illustrated ways in which knowledge from the global south is itself produced in contexts which have their own hierarchies, exclusions, and oppressions. And so knowledge from the global south is not knowledge outside of power. It is, of course, as we know, I'm not saying anything you don't know, it's knowledge produced firmly within power. And I think this is also what Karina was getting at earlier when she asked a question that invited us not to romanticize knowledge from the global south. So we know that the layers of power are complex. There isn't just one master's house that you're either inside or outside of. There are many, many houses, if we want to use the metaphor that was being used earlier. So if we consider intersectionality, we know that that we can occupy at the same time marginal relations in relation to one axis of inequality, but dominant in relation to others. And if we take this seriously, then we have to recognize that even the most ethical politics of citation can have problematic effects. And I want to show you two illustrations very quickly of unintended problematic effects of these assumptions. And the first example I want to show you is a more macro level one, and it concerns the relationship between what we do in global debates. I'm using globally very unsatisfyingly here, but for the purposes of time, the relation we see between what happens globally or transnationally and what happens locally. And I've written about some of these ideas elsewhere in a journal, in an article in the journal Science in 2014. But basically what I said then and what I still think about this issue now is that by often highlighting, often seeing relationships between, say, Anglophone hegemonies and local knowledge production primarily as a repressive relationship, i.e., the knowledge from the Anglophone context is repressing the knowledge from the Global South, silencing it, constraining it, we don't notice the ways in which the Global South may sometimes appropriate Anglophone hegemonies in local struggles for authority, or how Anglophone hegemonies may actually enable forms of knowledge production in the Global South. And I think this happens as well in relation to citation, and I'll tell you how. Many of us want to cite more from marginal communities from the Global South, but obviously we can't access all of the knowledge that's being produced everywhere, whether that's because of language difference, because we don't know who is doing what. And so specific people in the Global South or in marginal communities become more known because they are more translated, because they write in more than one language, because they are more privileged, whatever the reason. And a common phenomenon that results from this, as many of you know, is that then these citations become concentrated on particular people. So when we cite these people globally, we are equalizing power relations globally because our texts center more people from the Global South. But in so doing, we can intervene, not even being aware of this, in power imbalances locally, i.e., by citing someone globally to equalize global power relations, we can disproportionately invest people locally with power that allows them locally in their communities, in peripheral or semi-peripheral countries, to do all sorts of things. Many of you will be able to identify, think of examples of scholars from the Global South or from marginal communities who have been able to engage in sexism, racism, sexual harassment, exploitation of more junior colleagues, problematic working practices, because they are so invested locally with power in the periphery, in the semi-periphery, because they are cited very often in the center. So these names equalize power in the center, but they actually skew things sometimes very problematically in the local context. And so I think by this I'm not saying we abandon this desire to cite more broadly, but I think we have to be more circumspect in assuming that when we cite a certain person, someone from the Global South, someone who is queer or Black or trans, whatever marginality you're thinking about, we have to be more circumspect in assuming that that citation always does good and only does good, because I think that assumption feeds off and creates the illusion that some authors are innocent or more outside of power. And we know that people in the Global South, Black women, queer people, trans women, may also hold and wield power. And as feminists knowledgeable of intersectionality or well-versed in post-structuralist theories of power, we know that power is complex and no one is innocent or outside of power. Now, I have a second example. I'm going to mention that very quickly because I can see I am running out of time if I have not run out entirely.
Have
I run out?
1 minute left.
Okay, so my other example is what I notice as an editor. You know, sometimes I get articles from the Global South, and then reviewers from the Global North chastise that author for not having decolonized their citation. So the person in the Global North is telling off the person in the Global South for using authors from the Global North, and so we get these weird dynamics where authors from the Global North come to be the arbiters of how one decolonizes and if one is decolonizing properly. So to wrap this up, I think I have many explanations for why this might be happening. I think affect is a crucial one. I wonder if we know about this complexity, but yet we speak about these issues in more simplifying, binarizing, essentializing ways. Maybe because we, in this current environment where we are so keen to be good feminists doing things properly, we crave the comfort of clear solutions, the security of writing in the right way. And so I think we want to be in the know, as Akane Kane would say. So I think affect is crucial to understand this, but I can say more in the questions. And just to finish then, I would say that maybe what we also need in debates about citation is, yes, solutions, yes, strategies, but also a circumspection about those, maybe not be so complacent. I think we need to recognize messiness and entanglement. We need debates that focus not just on the individuals we cite and the individuals we show ourselves to be when we cite them, but debates that focus on the structural messiness of all this. And I hope this event helps to contribute towards that. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. That's a really important reflection on the complexity of decolonising citation. And I think those issues are going to become bigger and bigger as we move from a sort of first wave of committed scholars looking to decolonise knowledge towards another wave of universities engaging in university level strategies from the top down to decolonise knowledge. I can imagine the kind of ways that's going to reinforce local power dynamics. So next up, we have Asiya Islam from Cambridge University with neither hi-fi nor gay apologies for my pronunciation, interrogating middleness vis-a-vis class and gender in urban India. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Robin. I'm just going to share my screen. So the title of my presentation is Neither Hi-Fi Nor Gai Gujre, Interrogating Middleness Vis-a-Vis Class and Gender in Urban India. So just to start, I want to say a big thank you to the organizers of this excellent workshop and for everyone who's here. It's been great listening in on the conversations all day. I also want to add that what I'm presenting here today is very much work in progress, and I did have that case of pre-presentation nerves where I feel like this is not developed enough to present, but I am really grateful to have the space to do this. So I very much welcome comments and suggestions. And my transcript is available on the website as well, as has already been mentioned, so anyone who needs to access that can do so. So very briefly, my research is long-term ethnographic exploration of the lives of young lower middle class women in Delhi. And I look much more broadly at urban India, but for the last 5 years, I've been doing ethnographic work in Delhi. So the research is situated in the context of last 3 decades of socioeconomic change in urban India, following adoption of market liberalization and globalization in the early 1990s. This is characterized by emergence of new forms of work, such as in cafes, call centers, shopping malls, and so on, where many of my interlocutors work, as well as by growing inequalities. And there are lots of people who've written about that, and I can't fully go into it, but maybe we can get to that in the discussion. I draw upon the narratives of my interlocutors here to interrogate the refrain of being in the middle or simply middle. I propose and explore an expanded concept of middleness to understand young women's uncertainties of life making. My work contributes to scholarship on the marginalization of youth in the new India. To begin then, I would like to start with some quotes from my interlocutors. I'll begin with Nandita. Nandita is a young mother of 2 children who has previously worked as a telecaller as well as a paid carer. Telling me about her family and neighborhood, Nandita noted, "You can't say that because we are in the slum, we are gai gujre or destitute," and this is where the title of the paper borrows from. "If you see there her neighbors' houses and where they work, no one can say this is where they come from. One of my friends, she has a parlor in the market. So expensive. This is a hi-fi market. We consider ourselves in the middle." Jahanvi, a young woman who works in a cafe, also identifies as middle class. In conversations about how she had to assert her desire to be in work against her father's wish for her to stay at home, Jahanvi points to me as someone who's not middle class. So it's all of this way of talking, dressing, etc. You can tell. I can tell, like with you, can't call you middle class. There's a difference of personality, attitude. Finally, Chandni, who has worked in a range of jobs from call centers to cafes, similarly points to those who are high class to explain her own feeling of middle classness. She says, "And then with Rohan, her boyfriend, first time we met, Sumna, a colleague, had brought her car. She belongs to a good family. At that time, I was feeling quite middle class among all those high class people. I didn't even know how to say pizza." So the use of English word middle or phrase middle class is common among my interlocutors, as is evident from these selected quotes. In identifying themselves as middle class, my interlocutors become party to the narrative of the emergence of a global middle class, perhaps. But we know from the work of ethnographers that the material conditions, symbolic markers, and cultural meanings of middle classes, and I deliberately say middle classes here in the plural, vary vastly by social, economic, political, and geographical contexts. Indeed, in contrast to studies of upward mobility or studies of becoming middle class in the UK, my interlocutors did not aspire to or desire middle classness. Rather, they speak of it disparagingly. I argue that they call upon an expanded notion of middleness to understand and explain their lives. So because of the limited scope of the paper and the paucity of time here, I can't do full justice to the full complexity of the markers these women use to describe themselves as middle, and therefore I will resort to a more simplistic and perhaps a somewhat formulaic approach by explaining just three aspects of being in the middle. So we see Nandita refer to middleness by contrasting the slum housing she lives in to the nearby hi-fi or upscale market that some of her neighbors work at. Jahanvi, on the other hand, uses attitudes towards women's work and consequently women's mobility to argue that I, a researcher from abroad, am clearly not middle class as she is. And finally, Chandni, who may seem to be an archetypal aspirational young woman in the new India, talks about her limited exposure to global consumption practices as demonstrated by her not knowing how to say pizza, even though she was employed in the global economy and was very much part of the global economic production. Middleness from the vantage point of these three interlocutors then refers to being in the middle of the rich and the poor, traditional housewives and modern professionals, and workers and consumers in the new economy of urban India. Now, there are a few concepts that can help us to understand this middleness. The concept of boundaries, boundary work, boundary making, which is common in scholarship that understands class as relational and processual, is a useful way to capture my interlocutors distancing from the Gaye Gujre as well as those who are high class. But I think it offers little by way of understanding their experiences of being in the middle, distant from multiple positions. In geography, we have the concept of interstitial or interstitiality, which is used to refer to spaces that are in between and often marginalized, excluded, overlooked, but that can also potentially offer alternative possibilities. But perhaps it is the anthropological concept of liminal or liminality which comes closest to this reading of middleness. The liminal refers to the ambiguous state of the subject between and betwixt, passing from one stage to the next as developed by the anthropologist Turner. The quotes I've presented here exemplify that for my interlocutors, being in the middle is an appropriate leitmotif for the uncertainties of their lives against the popular discourse of growth and development in India, their marginalization in the globalizing economy, and their contested subjectivities between home and work. This state of flux and related ambiguities can be understood through the concept of the liminal. However, unlike the liminal subject undergoing a rite of passage, passing from one stage to the next, my interlocutors conceptualize their middleness as a lasting condition of their lives. Middleness is therefore distinct from liminality in its focus on the enduring rather than transitory experience of being in the middle. So this concept of middleness, which, as I said earlier, I'm continuing to work on, then serves the following purposes. One, it contributes to emerging ethnographic understandings of middle classes. Two, it moves away from seeing middle as just an emic term to describe class or just a local term to describe class, and towards understanding it as actually having explanatory power. And three, it adopts the interpretive frameworks offered by young women, recognizing them as experts on their own lives. And I'll stop there. As I said in the beginning, this is very much work in progress, and I look forward to hearing what you think about the paper.
Thank you very much. Beautiful timing. And yeah, really interesting reflections on how concepts of class, middle class stretch and have different intonations in different places, which raises loads of interesting questions. So next up, we have Abeera Khan from SOAS on queer secularity, stretching queer studies. So the floor's yours.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to all the organizers for this wonderful conference. It's been a real delight to hear everyone's contributions today. I'm just going to dive right in. So for my brief intervention, I want to expand on my theorization of queer secularity to discuss one of its main tactics, essentialism. So elsewhere, I've proposed the necessity for a critique of queer secularity, one which stretches the analytical reach of both queer studies and critical secularism studies to attend to their neglected relationality. What can the two schools of thought offer to each other through mutual extension? This mutual extension, I have argued, raises the need for queer theory to confront the secular contours of homonormativity as it is deployed in Euro-America, specifically the assumption that the secular self is the only possible way to be successfully liberal and liberated. In turn, critical secularism studies must contend with the increasing instrumentalization of queerness in the name of European and Western secularisms, particularly how these secularisms are deployed in the service of what Puar has called Western sexual exceptionalism. So underpinning both these analytical demands is a complication of both queer theory's normative views of religion and critical secularism studies as normative views regarding gender and sexuality. So here, I want to dwell on the work that both religion and gender do, indeed the looming specters they are transformed into, in the workings of essentialist discourses such as queer secularity. Further, I want to attempt an elucidation of the ways in which the essentialisms of religion and gender obfuscate the relation between religion and gender. So during the 2017 London Pride Parade, the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, or CEMB, marched with placards emblazoned with slogans such as Islam is homophobic, Allah is gay, and Islamic hatred and violence to gays, Islamophobia is an oxymoron, and East London Mosque incites murder of LGBTs. So the organization is the British branch of the Central Council of Ex-Muslims, a German association representing former Muslims or so-called apostates. So it's a self-described group of non-believers, atheists, and ex-Muslims committed to, quote, taking stand for reason, universal rights, and secularism, end quote. So deliberately provocative, the intervention was made in the name of LGBT people subjugated by anti-homosexuality laws by countries under so-called Islamic rule and by Muslim homophobia in the UK. So more broadly, CMB's political mobilizations are motivated by their staunch belief of the threat that Islam in particular poses to universal rights, and in particular women's and LGBT rights. So there are obvious queer feminist criticisms to be made of this articulation of queer secularity, the questionable locations of homophobia, and the exceptionalization of gendered, homophobic, and sexualized violence within the amorphous Muslim community. So I want to forego this line of critique and linger instead on the essentialisms at the heart of this mobilization of the religion-secular divide, the politics it affects and precludes. So what can the violence of essentialism, both the violence it fixates on and the violence it inflicts, reveal about the relationship between religion and gender? I suggest that investigating essentialist mobilizations of religion and gender, not as analogy nor as comparison, but as relational politics, may complicate our analyses of gender, religion, and their interconnections. So the following year, another spectacle unraveled at the same setting, one under a different political register, but bearing kindred essentialist claims. So a lesbian group, Get the L Out, carried banners stating slogans such as trans activism erases lesbians and protesting alleged anti-lesbianism. The small group handed out flyers bearing transphobic messages, eventually laying down their bodies at the front of the parade, bringing it to a standstill. So both interventions hinged on the threat of gender and sexual violence, but remained steadfast in their denial of the violence that is imminent to and inflicted by their essentializing politics. Vanya Hamzic aptly explains how acts of spectacular representation in the name of certain minoritized subjects tend to be destitute of any meaningful politics. Quote, "The real lives of the subjects of such representational acts are always already irrelevant. What matters is the spectacle itself." So CMB's culturally essentialist understanding of Islam and Muslims and their dismissal of the realities of Islamophobia contradict their claims of solidarity with Muslim women and queers. Correspondingly, Alyosha Tudor deftly analyzes how the transphobic politics deployed by Get the L Out relies not only on an essentialist notion of gender, but essentialist notions of the location of sexual violence as well. The overdetermination of, The overdetermination of violence to a singular source, Islam in the first case, trans women in the second, betrays a single issue politics that is both unwilling and unable to reckon with the contradictions and violent implications of its myopia. So in their analysis of the 2018 intervention, Tudor powerfully points out the irony of a group of lesbians protesting trans women as the biggest threats to feminism in a corporate LGBT+ event laden with the presence of police and army personnel. Quote, "Not only does such a move favor a transphobic history of lesbian feminism over an anti-war, anti-police, anti-capitalist one, it also tells a story of lesbian feminism as not being able to address transnational forms of violence, including sexual violence through imperialist wars." So this ostensibly feminist instrumentalization of secular religion and man-woman binaries, respectively displayed in these instances, rely on an obfuscation of the racial and colonial origins of these Manichaean politics and a simplistic projection of a victim and oppressor divide. So these politics are ill-equipped to contend with the reality that neither secularism nor womanhood, and indeed sex itself, are immutable, neutral, apolitical, or ahistorical categories, but instead norms that have congealed over time through the scattered hegemonies inherent to modernity. So rather than analogize, compare, or equivocate these essentialisms, I want to instead suggest that an analysis of their convergence holds productive possibility for our understandings of the dynamic between religion and gender. What do our queer and feminist politics stand to gain from a relational understanding between the violence of cultural essentialism and the violence of gender essentialism? Indeed, what is the relationship between both? So religion and gender are both sites of contestation for Western anxieties that are always already racial in their nature. While there is a broad range of scholarly inquiry on this thesis, less explored is how the mobilizations of cultural and gender essentialism set the terrain for seemingly unlikely alliances. An interrogation of this convergence can help us make sense of, for instance, how so-called secular inclusive feminist organizations such as Southall Black Sisters can maintain support of transphobic organizations and also express skepticism towards abolitionist struggle that aims to eradicate carceral violence. So rather than disparate political positions, the language and tactics of both transphobia and particularly Western European deployments of anti-Islamic secular hostility overlap in their insistence of the victimization of these political positions, both occurring at the detriment of a rigorous analysis of power and an expansive feminist imagination. As such, these alliances become not so unlikely when we understand that the trivialization of phobias of the trans and Islamo variety rely on a colonial division of humanity, whereby to be human is to be secular and gendered in the image of European man. So even though the articulation of the threat posed by Muslims often uses the language of queer and transphobia, the articulators of these discourses tend to have much in common with the repressive politics that the objects of their anxieties are accused of possessing. So shifting focus for a moment to contemporary anti-trans mobilizations across the Atlantic, an analysis of their language and tactics demonstrates the often contradictory enmeshment of these essentialisms. So while in the UK, the language of secular humanism structures the defense of Islamophobia and transphobia, Jules Gill-Peterson's analysis of a recent anti-transgender bill in North Dakota demonstrates how trans people are accused of violating the secular terms of public participation by simultaneously adhering to the religion of secular humanism and embodying a so-called non-secular sham. So here, Gill-Peterson observes how the language of religious neutrality is exploited to vilify a host of non-Christian identities, including trans people, Muslims, and Jews. Gill-Peterson aptly points out that these contemporary manifestations of sex panics are inseparable from a history of racialized policing. So this point is not dissimilar to Rahul Rao's argument in Out of Time, where he expands on Anne-Marie Smith's argument that queer-phobic moral panics are always prefigured by earlier racist moral panics. So in our interrogations of the violence of these essentialisms, we may do well to pay attention to how disparate deployments of the secular religious dualism can occur in the service of transphobic politics. Moreover, it is worth exploring how these interrelated processes are constituted by and perpetuate a legacy of colonial and racialized exclusion.
You've got 1 minute left.
Okay. So my intention with this brief provocation is to lay out what I believe to be underexplored dynamics in the relationship between religion and gender. So by confronting the violence of essentialism, the claims of violence it clings to, and the violence imminent to these claims, feminist and queer theorizations of religion and gender can elucidate the very relationality that these political mobilizations seek to collapse. Attending to this relationality can also reveal the existence of coalitions and conviviality, pleasures and positionalities that these essentialisms render unthinkable. So Tudor aptly points out how exclusive feminist fixations and sexual violence foreclose the possibilities of political pleasure and desire. So the essentialist politics critiqued above represent a dearth of imagination in their inability to conceive of religion, gender, and encounters between the two that can enable conviviality and solidarity. So Jules Joanne Gleason has argued for understanding gender transition through the lens of community-led social reproduction, what she calls the day in, day out work of cultural fabrication and mutual support that allows for trans life. Likewise, Kay Gabriel emphasizes the necessity of the political valence of pleasure in our gender politics, whereby the liberatory horizon of a pleasurable disalienated life matters to transsexuals and non-transsexuals both. So following these scholars' considerations, how can we articulate a feminist vision of a disalienated life, one that is expansive enough to pay attention to the ways in which gender, religion, and the interplay between the two are not simply sites of violence or ambivalence, but one of relational pleasures as well. So over the course of my own research on queer Muslims, it is such ephemeral moments of relationality that have enabled my own desire for feminist politics that is not solely arrested by the registers of violence and suffering of the here and now, but also invested in the liberatory horizons of a then and there. So I'm reminded of the members of Feminist Anti-Fascist Assembly standing guard outside the Inclusive Mosque Initiative's Jummah prayers, halakas, and iftars, a commitment of solidarity made to the intersectional feminist mosque in the wake of the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, where a white supremacist fatally shot over 50 mosque-goers in 2019. So the scene of people breaking their fast at iftars, many of whom are queer and trans Muslims, while volunteers distributed plates of iftari to assembly members made up of feminists of all genders, is an example of the conviviality and solidarity that is beyond the imaginative faculties of those whose political commitments hint on the violence of essentialism. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for really important reflections on the relationship between queerness and secularism. So now for our final paper, we have Hasret Cetinkaya from National University of Ireland on the epistemic violence of namus as honour. So over to you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me now? Perfect, thanks. Okay, screen is shared. Sorry, I'm just gonna find. Sorry for that. I'm just trying to okay. I just stop sharing. I'm just going to try again to share the screen so I can see it. Okay. Thanks, everyone. I still can't see my own screen. That's why I was just trying to figure that out, but I think you can see it now. So I'll just go ahead and then change the slides. So thank you very much. This is the last paper. So it's been really interesting to be here today, and thanks for everyone who's still staying here. So I'm gonna talk to you today about this concept of namus, and I would like to change my slide, but I don't seem to be able to do that. Is that right?
We can just see slide 1.
Yeah, okay. I thought so. Okay. You know what? I might just do this. Okay. And then we can start again like that. Okay. So I will focus on this concept of namus, as I told you. And this is not very easy. I apologize. I don't normally am this awkward with technology.
If you want, I can try to share. I have your presentation.
That would be great, actually. Thank you.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much. Perfect. Okay. So I want to reflect a bit upon this concept of namus, which has come to be known as honor. So if we can have the first slide, maybe. In the English language. And in the English language, this concept of honor is usually tainted and haunted by violence and gender oppression and that. And I want to trouble this framing a little bit in light of how namus, as a broad Kurdish concept, exceed this injurious translation. So at the core of my talk is the issue of how conceptual diversity gets erased and how meaning gets fixed through acts of translation and forms of moral critique, which benefit particular systems of power knowledge. To briefly touch upon what namus entails, it's a concept which stands in for a way of life, or an ethos which articulates into being that which is proper. So it sets out the normative standards for what is sayable and doable in gendered and ethical terms and within its own social order. And in relation to Namus, there is an epistemic unjust production of knowledge that takes place in the name of women's rights and freedom. For example, in 2017, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Dubravka Simonovic, wrote in a report that honor leads to femicides or gender-related killings of women, forced marriages, imprisonment, rape, incest, domestic violence, and suicide, end quote. Such a narrow framing perpetuates a very violent image of what honor entails and serves to aggregate a number of different practices into one catch-all category, whereby human rights produces its own subject as well as the object of its role by categorization. So I want to ask, what is to be gained in fighting against gender-based violence if it comes at the price of instituting new forms of symbolic and epistemic violence? This question suggests we ought to take pause and consider how certain concepts, such as honor, are articulated at the root cause of our purported patriarchy in certain Muslim geographies and cultures. So this task is urgent as there is an inadequate understanding of how Namus is a rich embodied concept that is lived and experienced in a myriad of ways. And many scholars working on issues of honor, both in the social sciences and human rights, often only ask what I want to call second order questions in relation to honor and Namus, as they fail to engage with the challenging questions pertaining to the ontological and epistemological presupposition of a liberal freedom and agency that shapes such analysis. If we can please change slide again. Thank you. So part of my research is on how the human rights regime of truth has produced injurious knowledge on honor and how the essentialist language of law cannot capture the embodied and effective dimensions of living with Namus, as it simply conceives of women as unthinkingly offering themselves up for submission. Through translation into our received epistemic frames, the life world of people living with Namus is assimilated into the dominant language of honor, a language which imposes limits on this unfamiliar way of life. The hegemonic language of honor as an English language concept fixes meaning, cultures, and concepts according to its own cultural specificity. And as a consequence, the internal contestation and cultural transformation within cultures of Namus goes unaccounted for. Translation, when conflating different cultures and practices into a homogenized category, however, poses a threat to misrecognition. And Namus, I argue, in a larger research, is an elastic concept which stretches beyond Kurdistan to the diaspora. It stretches from religious livelihoods to the secular ethos of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. And as a lived concept, is never simply written on the body in the Butlerian sense, but is also tied to ideas of land and community, is served to regulate the relationship between people. And it is omnipresent, material, and transcendent. And the women who live with and through Namus has an embodied and effective relationship to it as their truth. And so it's also serves as an ethical practice of caring for the self and influences the relationship between the body and its desire in the constitution of subjectivity and social being. So through the ethnographic research that I carried out amongst Kurdish women in North Kurdistan, Turkey, and Denmark, I want to just give a few kind of examples on the plurality of ways that Namus is lived, how it constitutes a value, and how it is a way of valuing what is a good life or not. So from the many interviews I conducted, there was a clear sense that the concept of Namus expressed the idea of a person with the virtuous characteristics of being honest and having strength, as well as having integrity and authenticity. For one middle-aged Kurdish activist in the west of Turkey, Namus resided in not giving your land to the hands of the enemy, that's what she was saying, which referred to the Turkish state. For a pious woman in Kurdistan, Namus was about having boundaries as it served as an immunity against social pathologies and social decline as she saw it. And finally, to mention one more example, for a young Kurdish woman living in the Kurdish diaspora in Denmark, Namus was what tied her to her culture, family, and homeland, as she cultivated a number of desires through the deliberate and reflexive disciplining of her body in a particular way. For many women, namus was tied to giving a proper account of oneself, of being able to explain oneself, and of acting in a truthful and just manner. And whilst this is a limited snapshot of what namus' empirical character entails, it nonetheless kind of complexifies our dominant ideas of what a life with honor entails or implies. So what I seek to illustrate is that namus is understood in plural and divergent terms, and that its character changes relative to its practitioner's own subject position. For these women, namus exceeded the all well-to-known tale of honor and honor-related violence. The narratives illustrate that what a rich concept namus is, as they further illustrate how its complexity is not captured through the framing of namus as honor, when honor is considered inherently violent and detrimental for women's life choices and their ability to express themselves. For women who are attached to namus and for whom namus constitutes a way of life, human rights discourse has but one response. If you had other alternatives, you would not choose this life. And the choice between a life with human rights and one with honor, however, is false and authoritarian, I argue. This blackmail expresses a core problem for any kind of substantive order of epistemic diversity. And we know from the work of many great feminist thinkers in the tradition of post and decolonial theories, such as Sabah Mahmood, and I'm quoting her now, that the representation of facts, objects, and events are profoundly mediated by the fields of power in which they circulate and through which they acquire their precise shape and form, end quote. So to raise the challenge of conceptual and epistemic diversity when it comes to namus is to once again return stubbornly to the problem of, can the subaltern speak? Or to put it differently, when it comes to a namus whose representation holds, that of the discourse of human rights and liberal sociology, or that of those women who live with and through it. So returning to the question I asked earlier as to whether the campaign on honor as simply a form of gender-based violence is more important and can make compromises when it comes to epistemic injustice, I want to suggest, in light of my ethnographic research, that epistemic injustice in the name of women's rights, is itself harmful, wrong, and reproduces a colonial logic of paternalism and sexual subjection. What is at stake is a matter of pluralizing not only our ways of seeing and knowing, but also our appreciation for plurality of ways of being human. If human rights law requires essentialized notions of gender and identity and only comprehends such complex lives to acts of categorization, it furthers what James Ferguson calls an anti-politics machine, which fails to take into account the historical, cultural, and political circumstances in which lives are situated. In doing so, it fixes meaning, cultures, and images of women as caricatures who are obeying and submitting to social authority in an unthinking manner. What Ferguson's concept of the anti-politics machine suggests when turned towards the discourse of human rights is that the latter's incapacity to imagine or theoretically accommodate the possibility of conceptual diversity. The women of namus, however, are not social dupes lacking agency nor voice. In order to turn the tide against such harmful representation, I argue that we need to amplify and elevate the understandings and concepts of the subaltern. Only then can we probably speak of conceptual and epistemic diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's spot on for timing. So
technology
leaves us with about 38 minutes for questions and answers. Please do keep sending through questions into the Q&A bit. There's a couple that have come up whilst we've been going through, so I'll start with those while you're thinking of more questions to ask. So the first one, it's the first two. There were two questions for Maria, but they also speak to general themes that were across all the papers. So I might ask them in a way that means everyone can answer if they want to. So the questions for Maria, we had one from Catherine. Both these questions relate to power dynamics between global north and global south. So we had one from Catherine talking about the benefit of working with researchers from the global south in UK institutions, but how that is in a context in which those researchers from the global south in UK institutions are in a privileged position compared to researchers in the global south. And there's a problem where institutions in the north can just draw researchers from the global south and Yeah, so the question there is, are these inescapable difficulties the kinds of things that Maria were talking about in relation to reinforcing local power dynamics when you try to address global ones? Are these inescapable difficulties, or are there strategies for escaping them? And there was also one from Eileen, where an article on queer issues in Argentine art was awarded a US prize for Latin American art history. And the awardee was a known misogynist and fatphobic bully in Argentina, but writing from a university in the UK. And the award was taken away after the reaction of the local arts community in the US. So the question there is, what do you think about instances where you get evaluation from the global north about academics and context in the global south? So I'll go to Maria first, because they were raised specifically in relation to your paper, but if any of the other panelists have reflections on, I suppose, how to call into question and subvert these power relations in academia between global north and global south, I'll come to you after. So yeah, Maria first.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the really wonderful questions. And I mean, my sense of these things is, and I guess if I had to leave you with one idea, it would be that one, is that to cite more ethically cannot be the end point or just a thing you take off. It, in a sense, for me, it opens new cans of worms, right? It's not the end point, it's a point where new challenges, new problems start. And I think your two questions are really interesting illustrations of cans of worms that are opened when we understand citation as doing certain kinds of epistemic and political work. And so if I go first to the question about the need for instances of evaluation from the global north to attend to the context in the global south. And I mean, in an ideal world, of course, you would want any moment of engagement with someone's work, especially a moment of awarding them, to be done from a place that is, understands the context in which this person is producing. But I think I think it would be unfair and unrealistic to expect that any institution in the global north could ever be fully aware of these complexities, not least because some of them cannot be uttered in the local context in straightforward ways. So I think yes, there is. I think that is important. Trying to understand local context and what is happening around authors when you platform them in particular ways. But I think that it's ridiculous to expect that people can do that fully. So I think it's also ridiculous to call them out when they don't do that fully, because I don't think that's always possible to do. So for me, I guess the focus is on a slightly different aspect of the problem, right? It's not so much should that US museum have awarded that person, clearly they didn't do their homework, but it was, what happens when we've got a way of thinking about citation or of thinking about knowledge production that assumes innocence or of certain people and to certain people. And I say this because, I'm now thinking of a particular example. I won't name the person, of course, but someone who is very big internationally and widely cited as a name that does something, as a name that disrupts power dynamics when you use that name, and the power that this person then has locally and what they're able to do, it's not just the power that comes from the number of citations that they have. It's a power that comes from the fact that because they are named as a progressive author, because they are named as someone who is good, who is pure, who is innocent, it becomes a lot harder locally to say, well, no, actually, you are really problematic, but you're famous for being unproblematic. So when the person is famous, I'm not interested here in the numbers of citations, but when people are framed as being outside of power, it becomes a lot harder locally to put them back inside power, because they should know better, because we don't assume that of them. So my problem is less, do we have to know everything about everyone when we cite or give them prizes, but rather, can we use name, can we have a way of thinking about citation that recognizes that we don't know everything about someone, and we cannot ever know everything about someone. So how we categorize the work that names do has to be a little bit more circumspect and less complacent. I hope that answers your question. Now, on the topic of inescapable difficulty, so the question from Catherine was, you cite someone from the global south that works in a UK institution. Is this good or bad because they're privileged relative to their compatriots, so to speak, in the global south? But also the fact that institutions in the north can draw on them is another manifestation of power. And again, I would say you're right, these are entangled things, but I would add another layer of entanglement, which is, we cannot expect of colleagues in the global south or from marginal groups to, I think sometimes we imagine that they are less seduced by the trappings of, authority and citation. There's a text by Paul Gilroy on Black neoliberalism where Paul Gilroy argues, as many other authors have argued, that if you have been denied authority, you are even more likely to be invested in authority. So of course, colleagues from the global south, colleagues who are Black, colleagues who are queer, desire authority, desire citation, desire power. And I think as feminists, we have good resources at our disposal to describe our ambivalent relationship to power. We both want to deny it, repudiate it, overcome it, dismantle it, but we desire it for ourselves as well, precisely because we've been denied it. So I'm really inspired by the work of people like Jennifer Nash, who look at the defensiveness of some of this, in her case, defensiveness in Black feminism, but other people who talk about these perverse pleasures that we get from our own marginality and how we can capitalize on it. So, and these things I would say they're inescapable. So we have to be better at putting them in the center of our debate rather than look for more innocent names or more pure feminists.
Lovely, thank you. So in the meantime, some more questions have come in, particularly for Asiya. So I did promise I'd open up this question to all of you. So I think what I might do is see if Abeera or Hasret, if you have any response to this power dynamics between North and South, I'll come to you next, then I'll ask the questions for Asiya, who has a bunch to answer in a moment. So Abeera, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think Maria put it quite brilliantly. I think the only thing that comes to my mind is that I think the kind of anxieties, this may sound kind of like vulgar materialism, but like the anxieties that we have about like, the extraction of like global South scholars, etc. I think we need to kind of have a macro approach and think about the fact that the politics of citation are embedded within very real material inequalities, right? And so I think that often the conversation around citation can kind of get presented in this vacuum, and in this very kind of like academic vacuum. And I think that we need to, I think one of the questions used the word extractive, and what if we thought about extraction in its literal sense as well as the kind of metaphoric sense that or the kind of figurative sense that we're using in that question. So I think like we can talk about politics of citation, but we also need to talk about the university system itself, right, as a global system. I mean, we need to talk about like academia as a material place. The ivory tower is a material place, right? And that's just, it's kind of, these are all kind of like messy thoughts, but that's kind of what I'm thinking through right now.
Lovely. And Hasret?
Thank you. I guess one of the things that I've been kind of thinking a lot about is this idea of decolonization and what we do with when we mention it in academia, and that task is always going to be limited and never going to be never end and never be fulfilled. But also we need to be really careful using it, because we should never get comfortable with that concept. If we are having universities that are too comfortable, we've done something wrong, because university is deeply implicated in our colonial world, and in the colonial, that's the coloniality of power that is also linked to ways of being and knowing. It's in relation to the North-South division, I guess I think there's a problem insofar as in relation to citation, and when we include and I think that's the point of this conference today, right? It's not that we just include the names of people from the global South or that we cite them in our papers, because that's actually not going to change anything. Going back to Sumi's point from earlier, it's the concepts themselves. It's not that we just introduce what has someone said, but it's interrogating those concepts and what they mean. It's to engage with those first order questions of what is the ontological and epistemic presuppositions in those concepts. And that requires a little bit more challenging work, and also a work where we refigure our own subject position in relation to power and our own implication in the university. And one thing I think is really interesting with the UK universities, I'm based in Ireland, in Denmark at the moment, in my cousin's room. So there's lots of toys in the background. But like one of the things in the UK is this ref system, right? As a young academic, we are all thinking about publishing in journals that have a lot of impact, and to which extent does that even escape the coloniality of power? I've just been thinking a lot about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So Asiya, you're welcome to add further things on this if you want, but you've also got a number of specific questions. So I'll quickly reel some of them off, but I think you hopefully see them in the Q&A box and the chat as well. So one is about the links between your work on middle classes and decolonisation. So what links do you see there? Another is, and that question was from Shalina. Then there was a couple of questions from Marsha, which are, is middleness a way for women to avoid having to make the hard distinction along class lines that socially mobile individuals often do in the early phases of social mobility? And the second question is middleness a performance which muddies the categories and thus abdicates women from belonging to either the oppressed or the privileged? So yeah, Asiya, if you want to have a go first.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to quickly add on the discussion that we were having. So moving away from the politics of citation, if I can just comment from the perspective of doing field research, there are two thoughts that came to my mind, and they might not necessarily directly address the question that Catherine's asked, but one of them is just troubling this category of researcher from in the global South, because, you know, what am I, someone who's very much based in a very privileged university in the UK, but doing research in India, and I'm from India, and there are all the complications of researching home. And I mean that both in terms of how people like me are often boxed into only researching home, therefore our claims only have value when we're researching home, but then our claims are also undermined when we're researching home because we are too much of an insider. And I am specifically thinking about the discipline of sociology here as well. So that was one of the things that came to mind. The second thing that I was thinking about and have been thinking about for a while is how, when I was doing my research, one of my interlocutors, she became my research assistant, and I don't mean became my research assistant in that it happened on its own. I asked her if she wanted to be my research assistant and help me with my research. And at that time, I just thought that this was the most natural thing to do. Surely she's the one who has most insight into the context that I'm studying. But what I found from then on, as I've applied for multiple grants, is that when you, for example, put in a bid to hire a research assistant, you're often asked if they belong to an institution, because the research funds can only go through institutions. And for someone like Pooja, who's my research assistant, that almost becomes an impossibility. And over the years, I found myself going back to research administrators and saying, no, I do actually want to hire her as a research assistant rather than someone through a university, because I think that's the most kind of efficient route to go down, so using that kind of terminology of research efficiency, etc. But it just makes me think about all of these different categories as well of, you know, who's an interlocutor versus who's a research assistant versus who's a researcher in the field. So those were just the two thoughts that I wanted to share in terms of global North, global South divides and thinking about decolonization. So coming to Shalini's questions, the link between middle classes and decolonization, I think what I'm trying to do with the presentation here, and very much in keeping with the theme of the panel is to participate in decolonization through diversifying and stretching concepts, right? And of course, when we do that, there's the question of where from and who's doing the stretching and where are these concepts coming from and what's their position. And for me, as I said in the presentation, these concepts very much come from my interlocutors. And this is why I emphasize middleness as not just a local term or an emic term of class, which it has often been described as, but as a concept that these young women draw upon to explain and understand their lives, or life making, as I call it. So for me, the practice of decolonization lies in that. And again, this is coming at it from a very field research point of view. I think secondly, again, this is Shalini's question about the wide range of literature on middle classes in India, including the work of someone like Satish Deshpande, which argues that people identify as middle class when they're not necessarily middle class, or that there's a kind of very wide understanding of middle classes. So if we sit down and calculate how many people are middle class, that's going to be a much smaller proportion than people who claim to be middle class. And this is an argument that's put forth quite often. There are lots of studies that keep coming up every now and then saying lots of people identify as middle class, but is anyone really middle class? And for me, that's a really interesting question, because how do we decide who's middle class? And of course, in economics and even in sociology, calculations of who can be categorized as middle class. But for me, that's not necessarily the interesting question. And for me, the point about identification is somewhat interesting, but I am going beyond that. So identification is interesting, but what I am arguing here is that it's not just about identification, but it's about these women's experiences and their understandings of these experiences, which is why I call upon an expanded notion of middleness, rather than just saying, oh, these women identify as middle class, and actually I'm not sure if they're middle class or not. So that's not the debate that I'm necessarily interested in. What I'm interested in is seeing how they understand their lives from this vantage point of what they call being in the middle. And I think this links with the question that Marsha is asking. So thanks for that question as well. It's a really interesting one. It's making me think about how, when I first was writing my thesis, I was going at all of this from a very Bourdieusian perspective and thinking about distinction. And Bourdieu would argue that those who seek distinction are bound to fail in seeking distinction. So all of those kinds of things came up. But for me, what was very interesting, and I think again this partly links with Shalini's question as well, what was really interesting for me is that these young women may be seeking distinctions of certain kinds, but they're also very critical of and reflexive about that process of seeking distinction. So yes, I think in a way they're not necessarily drawing these hard lines of where distinction lies, but this of course also then connects with the wider socioeconomic context that they're operating in, where things are in flux. And I don't necessarily have the time to fully go into it, but I'm also thinking about the sort of boundaries that are drawn between the market and the domestic, when of course a lot of feminist work tells us that those boundaries are much more permeable than would otherwise be thought or allowed, and how in that kind of interaction between the market and the domestic, their socioeconomic conditions are very much in flux, and therefore the work of seeking distinction or the work of boundary making is much more, for lack of a better term, up in the air. So there's a lot of ambivalence that characterizes their narratives. So just quickly as an example as well, we were thinking about Jahanvi in my presentation, who says that she really wanted to be in work and she didn't want to sit at home and didn't want to be a housewife. And this was a very common refrain among a lot of my interlocutors. But then what I also found was that they were investing in employment, but they were also moving in and out of employment and engaging in other activities as activities of life making. So it wasn't necessarily, even though at first glance it might have seemed like that, it wasn't necessarily that employment was the ideal way of being, or that was the only strategy of life making. They were operating on this kind of continuum where they were moving in and out of employment and education and family commitments, etc. So it was all quite ambivalent and in flux, and that's what I'm trying to capture through this concept of middleness. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So we've got a question. Maria has a question for Abeera and Hasret. So Maria, I'll come to you your question, and then the others, you can answer that one once it's asked.
Thank you. So a question specifically to the two of you. There was a word that you both mentioned, essentialism, that was quite central to your papers, although in different ways. And it got me thinking of something that I'm observing where, when I was trained as a PhD student in the Gender Institute, actually now Department of Gender Studies at LSE, to be essentialist was one of the worst things you could possibly be. You'd avoid essentialism at all costs. There's that kind of sense of post-structuralist feminist that really questioned essentialism. And it's very interesting that in the last 10 years, I would say in some countries, certainly in Anglophone contexts, even though essentialism, I think as a word, is still seen as something that one doesn't want to be, forms of theorizing that are premised on forms of essentialism, i.e. to say that the knowledge of Black women or the knowledge of this is a certain kind of knowledge, are much more dominant and are much more frequent. And actually, there's many things that people say that are quite essentialist, but are seen to be important interventions to make. So my question was, in your own thinking about essentialism, do you see this as do you see essentialism as something that's problematic, as something that's positive? And so that's in your own work, how you think about it, and how do you see essentialism in academic knowledge, academic debates around you? Thank you.
Hasret, you can go first. I think with my answer, I'll probably shift the register from academic debate to feminist debate, because I think for me, the work that I was trying to address is less, with the context that I was trying to analyze, they're less academic, but they're still made under the register of feminism. So certainly like groups like Get the L Out or CEMB or even South Hall Black Sisters definitely don't consider themselves essentialist, right? So that's something that that's the kind of like moniker or label that I'm ascribing to them and their politics. So I think that in a feminine, I think the word essentialism is still really important, or at least calling their politics essentialist politics is really important, and and what I was trying to argue was like making the relationship between different essentialisms is really important, because because they think that their politics are very complex, like the people that we're analyzing who we call essentialists think that that they're very convinced that their feminist politics are the right politics, and so yeah, I just think that the label essentialism does important work. Like one of my ethnographic encounters was at in a participant observation event. I went to an event commemorating the Salman Rushdie affair, the fatwa, basically, and it was all about free speech, et cetera, and there were people from CEMB and from South Hall Black Sisters were on the panels. And, the conversation went from anti-racist struggles don't support us like they did when the fatwa happened 30 years ago, to then like someone from South Hall Black Sisters getting choked up talking about how gender ideology is ruining us and it's part of a global socialist Islamist plot to have queer theory take over the world. Like these were all said in a very sincere emotional register. Like if we come back to affect, it was said in a very kind of with a lot of earnestness, but that is feminist politics that are essentialist, so I think that the word essentialism is necessary to push back their claims of kind of complexity. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
thank you, Maria, for the question. So I'll just say that I work in the field of law, and particularly human rights law, which is quite essentialist, and essentialism is to some extent required for the law to really function well. The category of woman, like there's a definable category, honor is a very definable category in human rights discourse. It's a very, very negative category. It's equivalent to debt, and they don't distinguish between honor and honor-related violence. So I was trained as a legal scholar, and when I did my field work, I was very convinced that the concept we hear from women would be very negative, and that they would have the same understanding because human rights had become my truth, right? This is what I was trained to believe in. And it was a very different, it was a very diverse, it was a very complex account. It was also often quite positive. So essentialism is something that maybe in gender studies that has been, like Linda Alcock writes in her book on identities, that the anti-essentialists have won the battle in the essentialism, anti-essentialism debate. And I think there is a lot of kind of awareness about essentialism in gender studies, particularly. I don't see that mirrored in the legal field, and I don't think we've had that discussion enough and sufficiently when it comes to human rights law, and to pluralize and diversify our understandings of concepts, and that there is different ways of living through freedom, rights, and different ways of having agency. I don't think we're sufficiently there yet, unfortunately. So for me, in my field, that debate is not something that was 10 years ago, but still quite relevant and urgent. Thank you.
So we've still got about 10 minutes left. So if anyone else amongst our audience has any questions, please do just pop them up in the Q&A, or pop them in the Q&A. In the meantime, whilst people are perhaps thinking of final questions, I've got a sort of a quite general question for all of you. So I'll come around to you in turn for this one, but in some ways across all the papers, there have been ways in which you've mentioned or engaged with sort of purportedly universal ideas, global discourses. So that might be visions of queer liberation that have at their heart secularism that kind of percolate across different places. Global middle class has popped up, an idea that there's an emerging global middle class, global human rights principles, laws, and so on and so forth, citation practices happening across the world. And in some ways, what some of you were doing was engaging with ideas that are located in a particular place. You're coming from particular ethnographic sites or particular places. So you're all kind of, I guess, stretching and morphing those purportedly universal ideas by coming from particular places. So how do you see, what challenges have emerged in your work of linking, if you like, the place-based and the kind of bigger and often power-ridden discourses that you've been engaged with? How do you manage to go about stretching concepts whilst trying to challenge and avoid epistemic violence? So I'll come to the panelists in the order, and feel free to take that question in whichever direction you want. So I'll come to the panelists in the order in which you presented. So let's go with Maria first.
Wow. I'm trying to think of a specific example. I mean, I think if I can connect your question back to the question earlier, I think from Catherine, about, inescapable difficulties of how we're entangled in these global power relations. I think one of the challenges I've found in using concepts, stretching concepts without doing violence to them, is trying to make sense of the temporality of debates and of concepts. I don't know if this has happened to you, but it's certainly happened to me, that I've been in, especially now during the pandemic with many events online on Zoom. It's happened to me that I may attend a session, a panel in the morning, in one context, in one language, and then in the afternoon, I attend another talk in another language, in another context. I'll give you an example. There was one day when I attended two events where Black feminists were speaking, one in Portugal, but through Zoom, and one in the UK, and they in the two contexts, Black feminist colleagues mentioned the notion of self-care, And yet their understanding of self-care was completely different. I mean, it was effectively as if these were completely different concepts. So in the UK event, the definition of self-care that was being used by the Black feminist colleagues was self-care as a sort of self-care is a radical act of protecting myself, withdrawing, minimizing the emotional labor that I do, especially with white women, you know, not having to educate them so much. It was a practice of withdrawal from the collective to preserve boundaries. Whereas in the context in the event in Portugal, the Portuguese Black feminists talked about self-care as you sorting yourself out, sorting your own ego out, your own narcissism, the worms in your head, as we say in Portuguese, so that when you come to collective movements, you can go in without projecting these ego issues into the movement. And so self-care is a responsibility that you have towards your collective to sort yourself out. And there were such different approaches. And I think there's something about we speak as if there's turns happening in different directions. And I, as a Portuguese scholar in the UK, I think I don't always notice how anglicized I've become, and the things that are annoying me, they're not the state of contemporary feminism. They're the state of a specific group of people that I happen to listen to more regularly speaking. And so I feel like I have to sort of step out of it. And I think there's something difficult that I haven't been able to work out. And I wonder how other colleagues feel about this, of being from other places, other groups, and the complacency that one feels that I carry that otherness with me, that means we don't always notice when we've sort of lost the sense of time and place. And the people we imagine we speak to are no longer as we imagine them. And it makes me think of migration. You know, we often say that migrants from a place exist in the culture of the place that existed when they left the country. So no longer the culture that exists now, but the culture that existed when they left. So I'm curious about how we lose a sense of time in otherness, and how that means we stretch concepts or fail to stretch them in particular ways. I don't know if that answers your question, Robin, but it's what it made me think of.
Lovely. So yeah, we'll go next to Asiya.
Oh, thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. I also don't necessarily have a direct answer, but it's making me think of a few things. So you're absolutely right in identifying the global middle class as a global discourse that I inevitably engage with in my work. And I think some of the work of unlinking is already done by anthropologists whose work I draw upon. And the work that anthropologists have done, of course, is to show through lived experiences that there are many realities of middle classes, and hence the use of the plural middle classes. So I think lived experiences in that sense is really important to that process of unlinking. But if I can just kind of take it in a slightly different direction, something that I've been thinking about, in my presentation, I talk about this notion of middleness and middle class. And you might have noticed, although I didn't say this in the quotes that I presented, some of the terms are italicized. And they're in italics because those are the terms that my interlocutors used themselves. For me, this is complicated and speaks to the lots of conversations that we've had today about translation, because what I'm doing here is, I suppose, conceptual translation, but not necessarily literal translation, because my interlocutors use the English terms middle class and middle. So we heard from a lot of presenters today who were talking about different languages and translating. And of course, there's the literal translation, the conceptual translation. But for me, it's also the kind of very specific context where my interlocutors use these English terms, and I'm attempting to translate them because they need to be translated, because they don't necessarily mean what we might understand middle to be in the global north, really, for again, lack of more specificity at this point. So yeah, it just kind of really makes me think about both lived experiences and these complexities of translation and languages. It doesn't necessarily address your question, but that's what I thought of.
Lovely, thank you. And Abeera.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, so your question on like stretching universal ideas, I think rather than trying to stretch universal ideas, what I'm trying to do is kind of explain why I'm against universalism, basically. So rather than trying to stretch already universal ideas, I'm actually, I think, trying to argue for parochialism. I think parochialism is really important in our work, and like situatedness is really important in our work. So rather than kind of putting forward to use the word again, essentialist argument that secularism is either good or bad, what I'm trying to kind of argue through the kind of history or the kind of genealogy of like critical secularism studies is that queer studies needs to pay attention to how critical secularism studies questions the universality of a specific conception of secularism that was born out of the anti-human project of the Enlightenment. And I'm thinking of Sylvia Wynter talking about how man too was the de-godding of, you know, man as human. So what I'm trying to argue for is rather than queer studies just attaching, you know, I'm not arguing for like a homosecularism kind of like general statement. Rather, what I'm arguing for is that we situate how secularism is deployed as a universal category, the work that universalization does and the violence that it inflicts through kind of universalization. And like in my own work, I think the way that I've benefited from this is also in the other way around, kind of critically thinking about how, as a scholar situated in Europe and in some instances North America, there is a tendency on my part to kind of fall into this idea that Evren Savcı critiques in her recent work, Queer in Translation, on the kind of Turkish context of this like work that Western scholars do of because they're talking through Islamophobia to then kind of reify the secularism versus Islam binary, and like basically universalize that, which is not the case. And by kind of working through kind of the queer Muslim context and trying to problematize the coloniality inherent in the way that Muslims are treated in Britain, also trying to avoid kind of positioning Islam as radical alterity or like universally a radical alterity, right? And so I think that's why I think parochialization is really important, and parochialization with relationality. So parochialization that says my work, you know, looks at a very specific context, but is related to the struggles there, or, you know, the way that power works is that it differentiates secularism as this in this case and that in that case. So yeah, so basically I'm against universalism, and I think we should all accept and embrace parochialization more.
Lovely. And finally, Hasret.
Thank you. I will probably echo that, Abeera, quite a bit. Hi, Salsa. That's my cousin. They're saying hi to you. Okay. So I guess I'll just talk a little bit about some of the difficulties I've had, that my work is everything else than stretching universal ideas. It's very much looking at the local and the particular, and that gives a problem, right? Because human rights are universal, and so how do we engage with the ideas in human rights? Like there's different ways of doing that. Obviously, I won't go into that, but I guess I've had a lot of difficulties in kind of explaining my work, because there is so strong notions, and it's so value laden what honor is, and especially in relation to Muslim women and women from the global south, that is really difficult to get the message across. And usually it's just that, oh, so you're saying that they have agency, and then it's just like this, there is really kind of an epistemic deafness. People just don't hear more. And so for me, very early on in my career, it's been experimenting with different kind of audiences, and how do I tell this story, and how do I kind of at the conceptual level diversify certain understandings, the pre-understandings we have, to understand honor through a different lens. So I think it's really interesting. I wanted to show like how numbers have been stretched to honor, but there are obviously in the world other concepts that has been translated into this catch-all category. And the monolingualism of Englishness makes us all think that that's how we can see and hear it. But I think critical reading is a particular way of reading and thinking, and that kind of help us to see things a little bit different. But it's a really challenging task, actually. I think this kind of conceptual diversity is really difficult, and it's difficult when the audience is not one that is willing to see that diversity always. I found that really challenging in the area of law.
Lovely, thank you. We're now out of time for the day, so thank you to all of the panelists for lovely, great presentations. And yeah, the workshop goes on tomorrow. I don't know if any of the hosts want to come in with any final remarks or bits of housekeeping for tomorrow.
No, just to say everyone, oh, sorry, Sumi. Just to say everyone, you're welcome to connect with exactly the same link that you connected with today. We're starting tomorrow 1 hour, I think, later. We're starting at 10:30 a.m. And I think that's it. Sumi or Mary, would you like to say something?
Really great to hear everybody. So thank you so much to everybody who's taken part, and to those of you who presented, and also to the wonderful, wonderful chairs all through the day. So terrific day. Thank you so much to everybody. And come back tomorrow, please.
Yes. Okay. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.